So x squared minus 9x plus 20. Okay, so I taught you guys last week the x method, okay, where you had to multiply a times c, put it in the little top of the x, put the b in the bottom, and we're going to practice that in a second. So if you don't understand the shortcut for when the coefficient is 1, do the x method every single time, and you'll get it right, okay? But if you understand the shortcut, feel free to do the shortcut and save yourself some time, okay? So let's practice the shortcut. So I want to decide, and I want to find, whenever, remember this is, shortcut is when my leading coefficient is 1, so when there's no number in front of that quadratic, okay? So I want to find out what are two numbers that multiply to be C and add, because that's a plus, to be B, okay? Remember, if it's minus, they would subtract. If it's positive, like if the C value is a minus, you would subtract. If it's a positive, you would add. Yes, said that right. Okay, so let's break apart 20. So we want to decide the factors of 20. What do I multiply to get 20? What's the first one?
4 times 5.
Ooh, let's start first one. Start with easy one. 1 times
20.
20. You were jumping to the answer. So yes, but wait a second. Let's just break apart 20. If you get it without having to write this every time, awesome, love it. Okay, then 2 times what?
10.
And then 4 times 5. And those are our factors of 20. So then we look at those and we want to decide what adds to give me 9. Okay?
4 plus 5.
And then that's where we get the 4 and the 5. And then we look at the sign in front of the B, that negative, and that's going to tell us that both of those are going to be negative numbers. Okay, and then we write them in factors. We go x minus 4, x minus 5. Boom, you have your answer. Okay? And again, you could have done this the same way with the x method, because what's the coefficient of that x squared? When we don't have one, what is it? What's that invisible leading coefficient?
1.
1, yeah. So if I were to put a 1 there, and then I would go 1 times 20 would be in the top. And so you would do the exact same process with the x method. Okay, so that was our shortcut. Now remember, sometimes GCFs and factoring work together, okay? So let's look at this one. 5x squared minus 20x minus 60. So when you see big numbers, when you see that leading coefficient is not a 1, then the first thing that you want to do is think, do I have a GCF of this? What is the GCF of 5, 20, and 60?
5.
Yeah, 5. I can take out a whole 5 from all of those things. Okay, so let's do that first. 5, and then see what's left. So 5 times what gives me 5x squared? X squared. And then 5 times what gives me 20x?
4.
What kind?
Positive.
Yeah, positive 4x. So what was your x? And then 5 times what gives you negative 60?
Negative 12.
Negative 12. Don't sound so excited.
That's good.
All right, so then from there, now is this something a little bit easier for us to factor?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a little bit easier for us to look at the numbers of. So then from here, you choose either the x method or the shortcut. Do you guys want to use, which one you want to do, shortcut or x method?
Shortcut. Shortcut.
Shortcut.
All right. Nobody's objecting, so we'll roll with it. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, so we need to find two numbers that multiply to be 12, okay? And then because that's a negative, they're gonna subtract to give us 4. Okay, so let's do it. So let's break apart 12. We have 1 in,
12.
2 in,
6.
3 in,
4.
there we're done. Okay. So now we look at those. We're looking at the things that multiply to be 12. And then because it's a negative 12, that means one would have to be positive and one would have to be negative. So they're going to subtract to give me 4. Okay, so which one's a subtract to give me 4?
2 and 6.
Yep, 2 and 6. And then we look over at the sign in front of our B, and that's going to tell us the sign of the bigger number. So that means that my 2 would be negative and my 6 would be positive because that's a positive 4. Okay, because if I were to multiply those again, negative 2 times positive 6 would get me to this negative 12. And then if I were to combine those or add them together, negative 2 plus 6 would get me to the positive 4. So that's what we are finding. Okay, so then we rewrite it, but we have to remember to drop down that 5 on the outside. So if you have one of these GCF ones, you have to bring that GCF down for your final answer, okay? So it just kind of hangs out front. He's kind of the outsider that hangs out outside of the parentheses. Okay, so then we open up our 2 parentheses, x minus 2. It's all coming from over here. And then x plus 6. All right, so let's do a couple of other factoring. Let's try to practice that x method, okay? So if we have 2x squared minus 13x plus 20. That plus. There we go. Okay, so first things first, when we see that there's not a leading coefficient of 1, we need to check ourselves and see, is there a GCF? Do 2, 13, and 20 have a greatest common factor? Yes or no?
No.
No.
No, 13 doesn't go into 2 and 20, or 2 doesn't go into 13 evenly, so I'm done, right? Okay, so 13 is prime number anyway. So that means that we now have to use that x method. So we're going to multiply, we're going to create our big X, and then we're going to multiply A times C. Okay, so 2 times 20, what is that?
Oh, 10.
Times?
Wait, hold on. Wait, hold on. Oh, shoot, my bad. 40.
40, okay. And then they were both positive, so it's positive 40. Okay, and then what goes on the bottom of my X? Who remembers?
Negative 13.
Negative 13, yep, my B value, and you have to keep that sign in front of the number. So it's going to be negative 13. And guys, remember, if you're just tuning in today and you didn't tune in last week to get this practice, there are videos over the X method from last week, and I even did the tutoring that kind of covers an example of all the things from last week, because we had a good tutoring session on Thursday. Okay, so now we want to find the things that multiply to be our top number, and then because our top number is positive, they're going to add to be the bottom number. Okay, so let's figure those out. So let's break apart 40. So we have 1 and 40, 2 and
20.
Yep. Those 3 go evenly?
No.
Those 4?
10.
Yep, 10. 5?
Yes. What is it?
8.
8.
Yep, and then that's it. Okay, so now we look at those things that multiply to be 40, these factors of 40, and we want to decide, because 40 is positive, because it was a positive 2 times a positive 20. So the 40 is positive, so I want to decide which one of those add to give me this 13.
5 and 8.
Yeah, 5 and 8 would add to give me 13. And then I'm going to look at the sign in front of the 13, and that's going to tell me the sign of my 2 numbers. So when we're adding, that means they're going to have to be the same sign. Okay, so the sign of the B tells you the sign of the numbers. When we add, they're the same sign. So it would be negative and negative, because the negative times a negative is a positive, but a negative plus a negative is a negative. So that's what we're doing here. Did that confuse anybody? Good. That's why those integer rules are so important in middle school to remember. Okay, so we're going to move those two numbers up into our x. And now we have to break apart our original problem. Okay, so we're going to rewrite this. We're only going to change that b value. We're only going to change that negative 13x, and we're going to break it apart with what we found over here for our x. So I'm going to drop the 2x down, or 2x squared. And now I'm going to come over to my x over here, and I'm going to rewrite those values. So negative 5x and negative 8x, and then I'm going to drop down that plus 20. Okay. And now that I have 4 terms, I can do a special method. And Taj, you said it way earlier at the beginning. What's that called? What do I do next?
Grouping.
Yeah, I'm going to group them. So we're going to use our grouping method. So we're going to group the first 2 and the last 2. Okay. And then I need to use my GCF. I have to use some GCF skills. So 2 and 5, do they have a GCF?
No.
No, but both of these terms right here share a what?
An x.
An x, yeah. So technically my GCF of the first group is just 1x. And then I want to see what's left on the inside. So we find the GCF of each group. Okay, so x times what would get me back to 2x squared? Sorry, 2x squared.
2x.
Yep, 2x. Then x times what would get me back to negative 5x?
Negative 5.
Yep. Okay, so now I have my first set of, or my first group I factored out the GCF. So now I'm going to go to my second one. And ultimately the goal is that I'm going to get a common binomial. Okay, so I'm going to drop down that minus. And then 8x plus 20. What's the GCF of 8 and 20?
2.
What?
2.
4.
4. Yep. 4. Okay. So then negative 4 times what gets me back to 8x? Well, 2x. Then they have to watch that sign on the very last one. The sign sometimes messes people up. Negative 4 times what gets me back to positive 20? Negative times a
Negative 5.
negative 5 would get me back to positive 20. And is that what I needed?
Yep.
Yeah, I have my common binomial. So those of you that either watched the videos last week or tuned into tutoring last week, how many times do I drop that common binomial down?
Once.
Once. So we rewrite it one time. Okay. And then I'm going to open up another parenthesis and I'm going to bring these two pieces, x minus 4. And that is your factored form. So that is x method. So negative 3x squared plus 17x minus 20. Okay, so is there a GCF? First things first, we always want to look for a GCF. Is there a GCF that I can factor out and make it easier on myself?
No.
No, so that means I need to go to my x method, okay? So I'm going to go to my x method. So this time you just have to be careful of the signs. That's the only thing that makes it harder is because there's so many negatives in that. Okay, so negative 3 times negative 20 is what?
90.
Positive 60.
A positive 60. Yeah, positive 60. So that's the key thing is you have to recognize that negative 3 and a negative 20 give you a positive 60. So now the top of your x is a positive. So that means I'm going to add. Okay, that negative in the front changes your sign here. Like, so you can't just look at that sign to be able to tell if you're going to add or subtract your numbers. And then same thing as normal, that number, that b goes in the bottom, positive 17. Okay, so this is where it just becomes normal x method, okay? Is from there, it's just, you just had to make sure not to forget that negative 3 and negative 20, okay? So we're gonna break apart 60, we're gonna see what multiplies to be 60, and because 60 is a positive, they're gonna add to give me 17. Okay, so let's break apart 60. 60 is 1 and 60, 2 and
30.
30, 3 and
20.
yep, 4 and
15.
sorry, yes, you.
Jesus.
5 and
12.
yep, and one more, 6 and
10.
oh, that's why this one's kind of hard because it has big numbers and multiple negatives. Okay, so we have all of our factors of 60, and so because 60 is positive, are they going to add or subtract to be 17? Add, yeah, because 60 is positive. They're going to add to be 17. So which one of those add to be 17?
5 and 12.
Yep. 5 and 12. And then we look here at the 17. The 17 is positive, so that means they both are going to be positive as well. Okay. So then I'm going to bring those up into my x. So I'm going to have a positive 5 and a positive 12. Okay. Now what do you do next to next x method?
Okay.
You break it apart.
Yeah, I'm going to rewrite the original problem. Write that b. So negative 3x squared. I'm going to look over here to get my middle pieces. So plus 5x plus 12x, drop the minus 20. Okay. And now what's next?
Oh, you gotta add the 5 and the 12. Wait, hold on. I remember.
Don't you have to group them?
Yeah, group them. So we're going to group the first two and the last two. Okay.
I said that. My stuff was muted, though. I said that. My stuff was muted.
Good, good. Okay, so now what is the GCF of negative 3x squared plus 5x, our first group? What's the GCF?
Can you repeat that?
What's the GCF of our first group? Negative 3x squared plus 5x.
Like X.
Yeah, it's just an x. That's all they share. Now, here's my tip for you guys, though, okay, on ones like this. If there's a negative in the front, factor out that negative at the beginning, okay? So let's take out a whole negative x. Okay. If you don't, you can still get the right answer, but it will be easier for you if you do. I'll just say that. It will be easier if you take that negative out with your first GCF. Okay? So then negative x times what will get me back to 3x squared, negative 3x squared. I have the negative and I have 1x, so what am I missing?
Bro, goddamn, Mr. Rosenbaum just sent me a freaking test.
And I have the negative and I have one of the x's, so I'm missing what?
3X.
3 and x. I see what it is. All right. Then negative x times what will get me to positive 5x?
Plus 5.
Would it be plus 5? A negative times a what would give me a positive?
Negative 5.
Yeah. So that's why this one's, like I said, this one's kind of harder because it's got a lot of negatives going on in it. Okay. I'm going to drop the plus. And then this one's normal. There's not the negative in the front, so it's not as weird. So 12x minus 20, what's their GCF? What's the GCF? 12x and 20.
2.
Is that the biggest number that goes into both those? Yeah.
It is.
Say it.
I was thinking 4, maybe.
Yeah, 4. It is 4.
Oh,
So, all right. Okay, there we go. 4. And then, so 4 times what gets me to 12x?
3x.
X, yep. And remember, that's our goal because we want to get that common binomial over there. Ooh, it's starting to freeze. Okay, so 3x. Then 4 times what gets me to negative 20?
-5.
Yeah, negative 5. Yeah. Stop. It's getting touchy. Okay, there we go. Negative 5. All right, so we have our common binomial. Okay, so 3x minus 5 and 3x minus 5, so we drop that down 1 time. And then we take our GCFs and drop them into another parenthesis. And that would have been your answer. Okay. Any questions on this one? Like I said, this is probably one of the hardest factoring just because of all the negatives going on in it. So you really have to watch your signs. But it's still, if the top number up here becomes positive, then that means at the top of your x, then that means you're going to add to get your b value. But if it's a negative, then you subtract. Okay? Any questions?
No.
No, ma'am.
No.
All right, so let's look at difference of squares and our perfect squares and those patterns. And then we will be free to ask questions or for you to go try to take your test if you feel ready. Okay. All right. So difference of squares. We have 25x squared minus 16. So first thing we need to notice when we are factoring, when it says factor and it gives you something that looks like this, is that first of all, we have difference means what?
Subtract.
Subtraction. So we have two things that are being subtracted. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to look for. Then we want to notice, you need to get in your head kind of like a radar, like a ding, ding, ding. Oh, I have some perfect squares. Okay, so if you need to remember, if you need to rewrite your perfect squares, if you want to look up, Google perfect square, whatever it is that you want to do, so you can remember you have 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, or you can write them down right now. So this is 1 times 1, 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, 5 times 5, 6 times 6, 7 times 7, 8 times 8, 9 times 9, 10 times 10, 11 times 11, 12 times 12, 13 times 13. Those are your major ones that will show up. Okay, your perfect squares, 1 through 13. Okay, so if you notice you have difference and then you have 2 of those numbers on that list with an x squared, then that means you should automatically notice you have the pattern, what we call difference of squares. So we have our 25 and we have a 16. Okay, so, and then we have subtraction and x squared. So how all we do from here is you break apart, open up 2 parentheses, take the square root of the first one. So the square root of 25 would be what?
5x.
5, and then the x squared turns into x. So those go into the first 2 spots. Then difference of squares means that one had to be positive, one had to be negative. So we put that plus and minus in the middle. And then we take the square root of the last piece and the square root of almost said it, 16 is what? Square root of 16.
Huh?
What times what gives you 16?
4.
4.
Get your math up.
Exactly. That's why.
Okay. Difference of squares, that's literally it. Take the square root of the first one plus minus square root of the second one. Any questions on difference of squares?
No.
No, that's it.
Okay. Last one then, perfect squares with a GCF, because sometimes you guys forget to take out your GCFs. Okay, so we have 2x squared minus 40x plus 200. Okay, when you see that, again, your first number is not a 1, so you want to automatically think, do you have a GCF? Can you make it simpler for yourself? So 240 and 200, do they have a GCF?
Yes.
What is it?
2.
Yep, 2. So I can factor out a 2 and leave everything else on the inside. So 2 times what gives me 2x squared would be x squared. That's all that's left. Then 2 times what gets me to negative 40x?
20x.
What kind? Positive or negative?
Negative.
Negative 20x, because that's a negative right there. And then 2 times what gets me to positive 200?
You said what?
2 times what gets me to positive 200?
100.
Positive or negative?
Huh?
Positive or negative?
Positive.
Okay.
Did I get it?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. See, get your math up.
Okay. So then we look on the inside, and what for the perfect squares, technically you could use like your X method from here and get the inside part. But there's a shortcut if you guys know your your perfect squares. So technically, what's the number in front of this X right here?
1.
A 1. There's like an invisible 1 in front of that. 1 is a perfect square. Okay. Is 100 a perfect square?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this has a perfect square, and then your C value is a plus. Okay, so you have a perfect square here, a perfect square here, and your C value is a positive. So then this is the shortcut for perfect squares. Like I said, you can still, if this is a lot and you're like, I just need to factor it like the other ones, go for it. But if you can remember this, notice those perfect squares, you have a shortcut. Okay, that inside part would just turn into 1 open parenthesis. Okay, when you have a positive C and then your A and your C are perfect squares. You take the square root of this first one. What's the square root of x squared? Justin?
X.
X, yeah.
Oh.
And then the square root of 100 would be what?
Mm-hmm.
10.
10. And then the sign in the middle comes from whatever's in front of your B. So it would be minus. And then you put a little square at the top. And then because this one had a GCF, we also have to bring down that 2. But that's only if you have the GCF.
Oh, that wasn't too hard.
And that's perfect squares. You guys want to see another perfect square real fast?
Sure.
I don't know.
Let me find one.
I can go for one.
And then we'll be done after that. Unless you guys have other questions. That is literally everything you guys have learned in this unit. It is big, but it was good. If you guys remember these things, you'll be a lot more prepared for Algebra 2 next year. Okay, so let's look at one more perfect square. Let's go 81 x squared plus 180 x plus 100. Okay, so the things we have to look for if we want to remember our shortcuts is if A and C are both perfect squares. Is 81x squared can I take the square root and it be even of 81x squared? Is that on my list? 81. Yeah. What times what gives me 81?
9.
9. Yeah. And then Is 100 on my perfect square list?
Yeah.
Yeah, what times what gives me 100?
10.
10. Okay, so those are both perfect squares. And then is that 100 positive?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so then we have a perfect square situation. So we open up one parenthesis, put a little square at the top. Okay, and then we said 9 times 9 would get me 81. And I need 1x because I'm taking the square root of that x. 10 times 10 would get me 100. And then I'm going to get my sign from whatever's in front of the b. And that would have been your answer.
Hmm.